In the chilly autumn of 1975, the town of Bradford was shrouded in an unsettling quiet. Known for its modest charm, with factories puffing smoke into the air and locals gathering in pubs, Bradford was unprepared for the wave of terror that would soon define it. News of attacks surfaced slowly, almost quietly, like a rumor whispered in back alleys. The whispers grew louder, rippling through nearby towns and unsettling communities across West Yorkshire. People had lived with a sense of safety here, but now women were warned by mothers and friends to avoid the darkness. The streets, once so familiar, took on a sinister air. But as more attacks emerged, fear sharpened into something urgent. It was no longer mere rumor, it was a living dread, feeding on the shadows. The papers began reporting brutal assaults, the brutality more savage than most had ever read. Whoever was behind them was vicious and methodical, targeting women who were alone or vulnerable, striking in the dead of night with hammer blows and stabbings that left police horrified. An unspoken rule emerged: the darkness was no longer safe. And as the pattern solidified, the figure of the Yorkshire Ripper began to haunt Yorkshire. Peter Sutcliffe was unremarkable, blending into the grey streets of Yorkshire with an air of complete mundanity. A truck driver by trade, Sutcliffe had a schedule that allowed him to traverse the roads of northern England at all hours, giving him a disturbing freedom to explore, to observe, and, unknown to those around him, to plan. He was a reserved man, with little to draw attention to himself. At home he was quiet, polite, even ordinary to a fault. He and his wife kept a modest life, marked by a dull routine that concealed a chilling reality. Inside Sutcliffe's mind, however, lurked dark urges he could no longer control. On a cold night in October 1975, his private fantasies spilled into reality. His first victim, Wilma McCann, a 28-year-old mother of 4, was murdered with a brutality that was shocking even to seasoned police officers. Her body was found covered in stab wounds, the injuries deep and fierce, each one a mark of violence and rage. The police were shaken but initially assumed the attack was an isolated event. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of a monster, nor that this was the beginning of a killing spree that would hold Yorkshire in a vise of terror for years to come. As Sutcliffe's attacks grew more frequent, the town's fear grew more pervasive, creeping into everyday life. For women in West Yorkshire, normal routines changed. Mothers called their daughters, reminding them to avoid lonely paths, to walk in groups, and to avoid the night altogether. In homes, pubs, and workplaces, people exchanged nervous glances, their conversations tinged with the anxiety that an unseen predator was prowling their streets. The media seized on the terror, broadcasting warnings, publishing gruesome details, and naming the unknown killer. The Yorkshire Ripper. Among the journalists covering the case was Olivia Hale, a young, ambitious writer who was relentless in her pursuit of answers. With every new attack, Olivia's frustration with the police mounted. She believed they weren't doing enough, that their slow progress signaled incompetence. Her articles captured the fear, the anger, and the desperation of the community. Some praised her for holding the police accountable, while others criticized her for stirring public panic. But Olivia was undeterred. She went to the scenes of the crimes, interviewed the grieving families, and sought out survivors. Her articles were detailed, raw, and unflinching. As she dug deeper, she began questioning the police's tactics, wondering if there were systemic failures that allowed the Ripper to continue unchecked. The articles became a flashpoint, and Olivia herself became a controversial figure admired by some, resented by others, particularly within the police force. The investigation swelled with each new attack, involving more officers, more tips, and yet more dead ends. Despite their efforts, the police were in chaos. Leads flooded in from every corner of the region, each one promising and each one a dead end. Witnesses reported vague descriptions, unsure recollections, and random sightings. The pressure was overwhelming for Detective Inspector George Lawson, a seasoned officer assigned to lead the investigation. As he pored over reports and witness statements late into the night, Lawson could feel the weight of the entire community on his shoulders. People were watching, waiting for answers he couldn't yet provide. He knew that their patience was wearing thin, and that each unsolved murder brought more anger, more fear, and more suspicion directed at him and his team. Sutcliffe, meanwhile, moved with a practiced caution that left little trace behind. Even when interviewed by police due to a tenuous link with one of the locations, Sutcliffe was composed, polite, and calm, raising no suspicions. He had perfected his ordinary demeanor to such an extent that, to the officers questioning him, he was just another unremarkable citizen. The decision to let him go would haunt Lawson and his team for years to come. In 1979, after years of unchecked violence, a woman finally survived one of Sutcliffe's attacks. Jean Ward became one of the few who could offer a first-hand account of the nightmare. Her survival was a rare glimmer of hope for the police, but a traumatizing ordeal for Jean herself. She was found, battered and bleeding, her body marked by his cruel precision. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors marveled that she had survived at all. But the terror would stay with her forever, a living memory of the night she came face to face with the Ripper. When questioned, Jean found herself struggling to remember every detail, her mind clouded by trauma and fear. She described him as calm, his movements practiced and unhurried, as if he were savoring the moment. It was like he was enjoying it, she told Lawson, her voice faltering. Her account unnerved Lawson, who sensed, perhaps for the first time, just how terrifyingly composed their killer was. Jean's story resonated with Olivia, who secured an interview with her, bringing the survivor's voice to the forefront of her articles. Olivia's publication of Jean's story had a profound effect on readers. The horror of Jean's experience was a stark reminder of the Ripper's brutality, and her survival became a symbol of resilience in the face of monstrous violence. But even as the public rallied around Jean, Sutcliffe continued his attacks, seemingly emboldened by his ability to evade justice. As the investigation dragged on, Sutcliffe's confidence morphed into arrogance. He began taunting the police, sending letters that mocked their failures. Each one was a twisted game, describing in chilling detail his thoughts, his fantasies, and his taunting hints about when and where he might strike next. The letters unsettled even the most hardened officers, adding a psychological element to the terror. For Olivia, the letters were yet another point of frustration. She published portions of the letters, analyzing the Ripper's words and pushing the police to intensify their efforts. Her analysis suggested that Sutcliffe was not only eluding the police but also taking pleasure in his control over them and the public. Olivia's articles became an open critique, a call for action that many supported, even as others accused her of sensationalizing a tragedy. Meanwhile, Detective Lawson felt the growing strain. The letters felt like a personal failure, as if the Ripper was targeting him specifically. He questioned every decision he'd made, every lead he'd pursued. But the attacks continued, and the killer stayed one step ahead. In early January 1981, after nearly 6 years of horror, the Yorkshire Ripper's luck finally ran out. On a routine night, police officers patrolling a quiet road noticed a parked car with false license plates. It seemed an odd sight, and they stopped to investigate. Inside the car sat Peter Sutcliffe, who initially appeared calm and cooperative. The officers noted his odd demeanor and, with growing suspicion, decided to search the car. What they found, a hammer and a knife, sent chills down their spines. The arrest was, at first, a minor incident, but as they interrogated Sutcliffe, cracks appeared in his calm exterior. With mounting evidence and relentless questioning, he finally confessed to the murders, speaking of them with a detachment that horrified his interrogators. His confessions were chilling in their simplicity, each murder described without remorse. For Sutcliffe, it had been a compulsion, a need that he claimed he could not ignore. When the news broke, the reaction in Yorkshire was one of disbelief and outrage. How could this ordinary truck driver, this unassuming man, be responsible for so much terror? Friends, neighbors, and colleagues were stunned, many of them struggling to reconcile the quiet man they had known with the monster described in the headlines. Yorkshire had been his hunting ground, and the people he had lived among, unknowingly, had been his victims. The trial of Peter Sutcliffe was a media frenzy, a spectacle that exposed the full horror of his crimes. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, their faces etched with grief and anger, listening as Sutcliffe recounted his crimes with disturbing indifference. Jean Ward attended, a survivor who represented all those he had attacked and left scarred. Her presence was a powerful reminder of those he had tried and failed to silence. The impact of the Yorkshire Ripper case would linger long after Sutcliffe was sentenced to life in prison. The investigation, marred by mistakes and missed opportunities, led to profound changes in British law enforcement. New protocols were developed to better handle serial crime investigations, emphasizing coordination and thoroughness. In the end, Sutcliffe's legacy was one of fear and grief, but it also spurred a resolve to improve, to ensure that no other monster could slip through the cracks as he had. Following Sutcliffe's capture, a heavy silence settled over Yorkshire, a silence laced with grief, disbelief, and relief. The community had been scarred in ways that would not heal easily. Streets that had once bustled with life and camaraderie now held a haunted atmosphere, a residue of the fear that had gripped every resident. Women cautiously resumed their routines, but the carefree laughter that once filled parks, streets, and pubs was slow to return. The Ripper had left a stain, not just on the city's reputation but on its spirit. Journalist Olivia Hale found herself reflecting on her role in the story. Her relentless pursuit of justice, her hard-hitting articles, and her criticism of the police had brought her both fame and notoriety. Some saw her as a champion of truth, while others viewed her as an agitator who had exploited tragedy. Yet, Olivia's determination to unearth every aspect of Sutcliffe's story did not waver. Even after his capture, she continued to probe into the lives of his victims, telling their stories with a compassion that honored their memory. She visited their families, who shared memories of their daughters, mothers, and sisters, filling her notebooks with details that painted each victim as more than a statistic, each one a unique life taken by an unfathomable darkness. Detective Inspector George Lawson, meanwhile, struggled with the fallout of the case. The investigation had been plagued by errors and missed opportunities that gnawed at his conscience. As he faced the media, community, and colleagues, he shouldered the weight of public anger over the police's failure to catch Sutcliffe sooner. Lawson's career would forever bear the mark of this investigation, and while he wasn't the only one accountable, he held himself responsible. Privately, he wondered if he'd ever find peace with the choices he had made, the details he'd missed, and the monster he had interviewed and let go. For survivors like Jean Ward, life after the Ripper was a new form of torment. The horror of her attack stayed with her like a shadow she could not escape. Even in daylight, when surrounded by family and friends, she found herself haunted by memories of that cold night. Her sleep was fractured by nightmares, her body scarred as a permanent reminder of the ordeal. The media's relentless attention only worsened her distress. Strangers would approach her on the streets, eager to speak to the woman who had survived the Ripper, but their curiosity left her feeling exposed. Seeking peace, Jean joined a group of women who had also experienced violence, finding solace in their shared understanding of survival. Together, they began to advocate for better support for victims of violent crime, pushing for resources that could help others heal. With Olivia's help, Jean's voice grew stronger, her story becoming a symbol of resilience and the enduring strength of survivors. Her experience with the Ripper became both a wound and a source of strength, a story that inspired other women to confront their own traumas and seek justice. As months turned into years, the impact of the Ripper's reign of terror remained palpable across West Yorkshire. Many residents wrestled with a deepened sense of mistrust, often questioning their own neighbors or wondering if evil might be lurking behind familiar faces. The police force worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, acknowledging their mistakes and implementing sweeping changes to investigative protocols. New teams were created, better equipped to handle serial cases, and officers underwent rigorous training focused on recognizing patterns and following up on leads with diligence. The psychological impact was equally profound. People found themselves dealing with symptoms of post-traumatic stress, though few had a name for it at the time. For Olivia Hale, the experience of covering the Ripper case continued to haunt her career. Her articles had held the community together in a time of fear but had also intensified public scrutiny of the police. Despite the recognition she received, Olivia found herself questioning the cost of her work and the toll it had taken on her own well-being. She remained committed to giving voice to the victims and survivors, but found herself haunted by the darkness she had witnessed. Even after his capture, Sutcliffe's taunting letters lingered in the minds of the officers who had read them. The Ripper's arrogance, his twisted pride in his crimes, had driven Lawson and his team to the brink. It was clear now that these letters had been another weapon in Sutcliffe's arsenal, a method of psychological warfare that kept the police on edge, taunting them with his unrelenting control over their failures. The letters were studied, dissected by criminal psychologists, who sought to understand the mind of a killer who could murder with such callous indifference. Years later, criminologists would revisit these letters, finding in them insights that could have pointed to Sutcliffe's capture sooner. The letters became case studies in the psychology of killers and the need for better communication across police departments. Some officers involved in the investigation retired shortly after Sutcliffe's capture, exhausted and disillusioned by the experience, while others dedicated themselves to reform, determined that no other community should endure what West Yorkshire had. As time went on, Olivia Hale found herself compelled to revisit the Ripper's story. She wanted to understand the man she had reported on for years, the lives he had destroyed, and the system that had allowed him to evade justice for so long. Writing a book about the case, she immersed herself once more in the details, interviewing new sources, revisiting old articles, and examining police records. Her book painted a comprehensive picture of the case, unflinching in its criticism of the police, but also compassionate toward the men and women who had struggled within a broken system. Olivia's work became a sensation, lauded for its brutal honesty and in-depth examination of the Ripper case. She toured the country, speaking about the role of the media, the responsibility of law enforcement, and the resilience of survivors like Jean Ward. Yet, each appearance reopened wounds, and the intense public interest in her work left her emotionally drained. Despite this, she felt a sense of closure. She had done her best to bring justice and understanding to a community that had suffered too much, and in doing so, she found a degree of peace for herself. By the late 1980s, the changes to British policing were tangible. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation had spurred reforms that touched nearly every level of law enforcement. From technological advancements in record-keeping to the development of specialized criminal psychology teams, the landscape of policing had shifted. Women, who had long felt overlooked by law enforcement, found their voices amplified in the movement toward reform, advocating for more sensitivity and seriousness in handling cases of violence against women. Public awareness campaigns highlighted the importance of reporting suspicious behavior and urged communities to look out for each other. Women's organizations received new funding, creating hotlines and safe spaces for women who needed help. The term serial killer became more than just a horrific label. It represented a new kind of criminal that police were now better equipped to identify, understand, and apprehend. For Peter Sutcliffe, the prison walls became his world. The quiet, unremarkable man who had roamed Yorkshire's streets was now confined, the echoes of his violent past reaching him only through the infrequent letters he received or the stares of guards and other inmates who knew of his crimes. In interviews, Sutcliffe remained largely unrepentant, his detached manner unnerving even the most seasoned psychologists. He claimed his acts had been spurred by an uncontrollable force, but few believed his words, dismissing them as the manipulations of a mind that could never face its own cruelty. The memory of Sutcliffe, however, never fully faded from Yorkshire. For years to come, parents would warn their children about strangers, women would cast wary glances over their shoulders, and the stories of the Yorkshire Ripper would serve as cautionary tales. Though Sutcliffe's reign had ended, the mark he left behind would serve as a reminder of the vigilance needed to protect communities from those who walked among them undetected. Years after the capture of the Ripper, West Yorkshire rebuilt itself, slowly reclaiming the sense of safety that had once defined its towns and cities. Residents came together to honor the memories of those lost, organizing memorials, gatherings, and fundraisers that supported victims of violent crime. Olivia Hale continued her work, focusing her reporting on issues affecting women, advocating for the forgotten victims of crime. Jean Ward, too, became a quiet but powerful voice in the movement for survivor support, helping women find strength in sharing their stories. The people of Yorkshire had endured one of the darkest chapters in British history, but from the horror, a powerful legacy of resilience emerged. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper would remain etched in memory, a reminder of both the dangers that lurk unseen and the strength of communities determined to overcome fear. And while the town's scars would never fully disappear, they became symbols of resilience and unity in a place that would always remember, but would never again be defined by the terror that once held it in its grip.